Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jean-François Bonnefon. He's a research director at the French Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, affiliated to the Toulouse School of Economics, the Toulouse School of Management, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. He holds the Moral AI Chair at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Toulouse Institute and is the president of the European Commission Expert Group on the Ethics of Driverless Mobility. He conducts research on decisions which have a moral component, especially in the context of machine ethics and human AI cooperation. His research appeared in more than 100 academic articles in outlets that include Science, Nature, and PNAS. So, Dr. Bonnefon, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Okay, great. So, you research morality from a cognitive
Yep,
science perspective, right? So, I've already had some moral psychologists and moral philosophers on the show, but could you tell us or give us a brief summary, let's say, of what is morality from a cognitive science perspective?
sure. I mean, when you're a psychologist or you study behavior, it always starts with something that people do. And in that case, I think the crudest description of what people do in this case, in the morality case, is that they rate in their mind actions or other people on some kind of scale that goes from right and wrong. And then once they have rated action or people on that scale, they make decisions based on this rating. So it sounds like very abstract, but if you think about it, that's what we do. We observe people. We have all these processes in our mind that allow us to rate them as good or bad people, right and wrong action. And based on that classification, we change our behavior. So that's what morality is from my cognitive sciences point of view.
Hmm. So, and you also study trust and cooperation, and I guess that these two aspects, and particularly even more so, trust, play a big role in moral behavior. Is that correct?
Right. So that's it's related to the second stage of morality, if you want. When I say, in morality, you rate people in your mind, and then you make decisions based on this rating. Trust is related to the second stage. That is, you're much more likely to trust someone that you've categorized as the good person in your mind. So this part is like the decision engine. Trust is going to be a consequence of the classification you made,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
cooperation too. But of course, it's all like some kind of circle, because if you categorize someone as a good person, you're more likely to cooperate with that person. Of course, if you observe someone cooperating with someone else, then you're more likely to categorize that person as a good person, and then it's like self-reinforcing, of course.
Hmm. Yeah, I understand. And so, I mean, it could be the case that morality has some universal components across cultures and across societies, and also some variations, right?
Yep.
And last year, 2019, if I'm not mistaken, you were author in a paper that really went into that kind of thing. I mean, you studied universals and variations in moral decisions across 42 different countries with 70,000 participants, right? So, what
Yep.
are some of the conclusions, some of the main conclusions you arrived at there?
Okay, so maybe a slight bit of context here to just to explain why we're doing that, because
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
true as you said that you can always ask this question about what is universal immorality and what is culture dependent. And in a sense, we were interested in a just little narrower, formulation of these problems, which is a situation where you have some kind of qualitative universality and quantitative variation. So there are things for which everybody sort of agree, So that's sort of universal, but then there's variation in how much. So let me take an example. For example, I think almost everywhere in the world, people think that sharing is better than hoarding.
Mm-hmm.
That you're a better person if you share your things than if you keep everything for yourself. I don't think I know a single culture where people think you're a better person if you don't share. But so that's the universal part. But of course, the amount that is appropriate for sharing is going to be very much dependent on culture. In some culture, you're expected to share a lot to be a good person. In other cultures, sharing just a little might be enough. You can also think, just to give a second example to really nail this, everywhere, almost everywhere, if you harm someone accidentally, then it's not as bad from a moral point of view than if you hurt someone intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I don't think I'm aware of any single place in the world where it's the opposite, where people would think that accidentally harming someone is worse, than intentionally hurting. But again, also big variation in the difference it makes in the mind of people. All right. So we were interested in these situations where everybody sort of agree on the direction of what is right and wrong, but then there's a lot of variation in the quantitative aspects. And so we used these things called the trolley problems, when you have to decide between, uh, saving one and saving five. Is it ever okay to kill one person to save five? And we use a bunch of these problems, like classic variants of these problems, where you have to kill one person to save five, but sometimes, you really need to kill one person. In other times, it's sort of a side effect that you kill that person. Sometimes you have to actively push, for example, someone to kill them. In other time, you just have to pull a lever, so there's no personal contact or harm. And in line with what I explained, what we observed is that these several scenarios, they were always ranked in the same order of moral wrongness or rightness. Everywhere in the world, people sort of agreed on which action was the worst, which action was the second worst, which action was the third worst. But the degree to which they felt these actions were bad were super dependent on culture. So universal agreement on the big picture, lots and lots of variation on the smaller picture.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Yeah,
need
but
to,
but
yeah,
but it's still interesting that there are so many commonalities, right? So,
yeah.
what do you think is the place, or just to reframe the question, where do you think these universals stem from? Do you think that they are in any way the result of evolution by natural selection in terms of moral behavior, or do you think that's something else? I mean, did you explore that in the article or not?
Uh, no,
Okay, okay.
no. We very cautiously pointed to different interpretations that you could make when you find that some aspect of morality seems to be culture independent. I think that you have, two ways to interpret that. One of these ways is to say, well, that's because it has nothing to do with morality per se. It's just like the reflection of a very basic cognitive perception process about the way our brain processes the world. And sometimes some of the rules that our brain uses to assess the actions of other people leak into our processing of moral behavior. And if people have the same basic cognitive processes everywhere in the world, then you will have the same leakage into their moral thinking. That's one way, right? Another way is to say sometimes maybe uh, the universal components of morality are there because there are some common problems that humanity have in coordination, which have the same solutions in all behavioral ecologies. that everywhere in the world, one classic problem popped out, like sharing, distribution of risk in human tribes, and sharing of resources in order to hedge, the risk for everyone. Something like that happened everywhere, and it has a very obvious immediate solutions like sharing that became sort of universal. And some behaviors became universally judged as right because they were universal solutions to universal problems for humans. I don't have a horse in that race personally.
Okay, so I mean, you can't really, from the data that you obtained and from the work you've been doing on morality and moral behavior from a cognitive science perspective, you don't have any take on the innate versus, or not the debate in terms of moral behavior in this case,
That's You're right. It's a bit different. In nurture or nature is a bit different from universal or not. I
Okay.
mean, as I said, sometimes if you find a universal in morality, it could be because it reflects some innate universal brain process. And that could be one explanation. It could also reflect some universal nurturing. That is that at some point, some very common problems that humans have the same solution everywhere. And if there is very little cultural variation in the solution we have to a problem, then we will have very little variation in how this problem is moralized or how the behavior is moralized. I know this one is a little less obvious, but it's also a possibility. And I think actually that it's not like one or the other. I'm pretty sure that these two things happen and other things happen that lead to variation. And it's pretty obvious that some things are innate, some things are not, some moral judgments reflect innate nature, some other judgments reflect cultural nurture, and that's it.
Yeah. So back in 2014, you were also author in a paper titled "People Believe Each Other to Be Selfish, Hedonic Maximizers." So,
Right.
could you explain what you really explored there, and maybe then I will ask you a follow-up related to this last topic.
Okay. So that paper was the psychologist's take on a philosophical problem, I guess. About why do we do good to the other people when it's costly for us? Why do we do altruistic actions? And if you look philosophers, some philosophers are going to argue that altruism really does not exist, in fact, because when people do good things to others that come as a material cost to themselves, they always expect some kind of benefit. And one possible benefit is to feel good. That's the hedonic benefit. That if you do good things to others only because you want to feel good, then it's not altruism. It's just selfish hedonic maximization. You just have to replace the economic approach. Well, supposedly the approach of economists that you do things that maximize your material gain. You replace that by the idea that you do things that maximize your emotional state, your hedonic state, and well, then you have an explanation of altruism. So I'm not really interested into this philosophical debate, well, because I'm a psychologist, and what I was interested in was what do people think about that when they see someone doing something good at a cost. Do they believe that that person necessarily did it because they expected to feel good? Is that the reason why they were doing that? Or is it possible for people to think that someone really felt bad about an altruistic action and did it in any case? because that person was really that good a person. And what we observed in that paper is that no, it seems very hard for people to think that someone did something generous but felt bad about it, or were that person. People think that if you do something generous, the net effect is always positive on you. That you never, or I should rephrase that you don't do something generous if you don't expect a good feeling about it and a net positive effect on your emotional state. That was it.
Mhm. But this is about what people believe and how they interpret the acts or the moral acts of others. So we could say that this is sort of folk morality, a little bit theory of mind of how people tend
Totally.
to how people tend to think about others' actions. It's not it doesn't entail anything about what's really happening and what are the sorts of motivations that lead people toward
Yeah. Yeah.
a specific kind of behavior.
Absolutely. May I jump here? Because that's a very good point. Because sometimes, I try to explain what I do by saying that with a problem like that, some philosophers are going to argue about what is altruism. Can we say that it is still altruism when people do this for that reason? Fine, that's like a normative debate or ontological debate, whatever. The economist might say, but let's actually try to have very clever ways to measure people motivation when they do something altruistic and have very subtle treatments that will allow us to compute their utility functions. What are their real motivations? But the psychologist, who I am, is going to say, okay, no, what I'm going to do is to see what would other lay people think when they see someone doing something altruistic. What are they going to think about their motivations? And that, I think, are three, related and very much interacting, but kind of separate jobs.
Mhm. And by the way, since we referred to human universals earlier in the conversation, is this belief that people tend to be selfish, hedonic maximizers universal in any way? Do you know that, or was this something that you studied only in, let's say, a weird culture, right? Like
Oh yeah,
Joe Henrik
totally
put it.
weird. Yeah, no, that was like, I can't remember now, but definitely weird population. And you're right. I don't know. So it's very interesting, actually. Is it something specific to the Western industrialized world that we are so cynical about the motivation for altruism? Or yeah, that's a very good point.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, but you're not sure, right?
Oh no, 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 no. I'm definitely not sure.
Yeah.
Huh. I'm not even sure I want to risk a prediction right now.
Okay, that's totally fair. So, and another thing that you've also explored in your work has to do with gender and gendered behavior. And it's interesting because you also, in your work, explore how intersexual competition might influence moral behavior. Is that correct? And could you tell us about that?
Yeah, yeah, that's a complicated way to say something that I'm sure you'll think is very simple. In fact, I think it all started for me with this recurring observation that men seem to have a priority for saving women from harm compared to saving other men. And some people might say, yeah, okay, duh, trivial, or whatever. But as a psychologist, you see something like that, and you think, why? What is going on here? And usually, what you will find is something. Okay, so if you have a choice between helping a man or a woman, saving a man or a woman, what would you do? And men will tend to say that they'll help the woman or save the woman. But I thought, how far can you go? What if you tell men, if you have a choice between saving the life of one woman or saving the life of five men, what would you do? Because now you know you've got a choice between 5% or 1%. That usually makes a big difference in people's mind. It seems obvious to them that you have to save the greater number. But the trick here was really to genderize the problem and to see what people would do. So if you ask a woman, would you save would you save one man or 5 women? Women will say, yeah, I'll save the 5. And actually, you can flip the genders. Women will tell you, I'm going to save the 5 people. But men, we found that a very, very big number of men, I can't remember, probably 40% of men, said that they would let 5 men die to save a woman.
To save one single woman.
Save one woman. Yes, I don't know if she's single in that scenario, but she's definitely alone, a woman. But and here you see something like that, and you think, okay, it could be some kind of cultural norm, like chivalry, or you have to save women first because you're a gentleman, or something like that. Or it could be something a bit more shady about intrasexual competition, your competition with other men to be considered by women as a partner. And here I think you can already see the asymmetry. Imagine that you're a young man going to college. So you're going to a small college in a small town, and you arrive there and you discover that all the other students are women, and you're a straight man. Yeah. Might be a shock, but it sounds very promising, right? In terms of dating, that sounds like a very, very promising situation for you. Now imagine you're a young woman, straight woman, and you go to a small college and you discover that all the other students are men. I mean, maybe promising. I've not done a poll, but I'm not sure young women are as excited as young men by such a possibility. And that reflects some asymmetries in the way women that may compete with another to be considered as partner by the other sex. So anyway, what we thought was, okay, maybe men say they want to let many men die to save one woman because of this benevolent sexism, gender norm in society, or maybe they just think, 5 men less, 5 men fewer, one more woman, better for me.
Yeah.
And so we did a few things to sort out the 2 explanations, but I'm going to tell you my favorite finding from that paper, which is that we did something really, really simple. We just changed the age of the characters. We told people, would you let 5 men die to save one woman if all these people are 30-year-old? Or would you let 5 men die to save one woman if all these people are 50-year-old? So basically, we changed the age so that the woman in question will move to reproductive age younger to non-reproductive age older. And what we find is that when everyone is 30-year-old in the scenarios, men want to save the woman and let the 5 men die. But when you turn people 50 in the scenario, then you no longer have that preference. Suddenly, saving the one woman and letting the 5 men die is no longer attractive for men if all these characters are older. So it's not definitive proof, but it's certainly more compatible with an explanation in terms of I'm going to put myself in a better dating position, if I may simplify it that way, rather than an explanation in terms of, hey, there is a social norm of benevolent sexism that says I should help women. Because 30-year-old to 50-year-old should not make a big difference to the social norm of benevolent sexism, right? But it does make a big difference in terms of the dating thing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I mean, since we're talking about gender and gendered behavior, what are gendered products? I mean, gendered products that are out there on the market, I guess. And how do they affect their users?
Okay, so I can talk about this, although I usually prefer my colleague Sylvie Boho, who was the lead author on this research talk, but
Yeah.
just very briefly tell you about what we looked at. It was, gender product. I mean, do you know you can have earplugs that come in male packaging or earplugs that come in a female packaging? You can buy earplugs in a black packaging, with lots of word like powerfully silencing or strongly successful, and earplugs in pink packaging that say for cute ears and things like that. And you can have that with toothpaste, with whatever you think of. There's probably a version of a product that's marketing to men, and a version of the product which is the same, really, that is marketed to women.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, it sounds a little bit ridiculous to have these different versions, and also brands can have trouble with that. For example, the Big Pens, they marketed a big pen for women, and it was like glossy and shiny and pink or mauve, and it was marketed as being easier to handle for little hands. And like, come on. I don't think women ever had a recorded problem in the history of pens, with manipulating big pens. I mean, and that is not sounding quite as I figured, but okay. So there was no need for such product. It is actually insulting to women to think that up to now they had problems writing, because the Bic was too big for their hands. Same thing with the Dorito chips for women, which are supposed to be less crunchy because women don't like to make too much noise when they eat. You can imagine the very bad advertising that this kind of thing get on Twitter, deservingly, I think. Okay, so if as a brand you're gonna have the risk of getting so much heat about your gender marketing campaign, why do you do it? Why do people buy these things? And some people will tell you that's because we're brainwashed by advertising, but it's always, before you get to this advertising and marketing conspiracy that is able to brainwash us, it's always a good starting point to say, is there a reason why people would want these things, even before you advertise them to people? And what we explored was the idea that if you buy this stereotypically male or female products, I mean, it's the same product, but it just comes in two different shapes and colors. And if you buy the one that matches your gender, you're going to look more attractive to other people, which is a weird thing, right? But it's basically, we said, some kind of some kind of an extended phenotype issue. That is that, as it turns out, many people from one sex who are straight are attracted to stereotypically masculine or feminine behavior in the sex they're interested in. And so displaying this stereotypically male or female behavior through your purchase of basic product is one way to advertise your stereotypical masculinity or femininity. And it's not going to please everyone, but it pleases enough people that you may want to do it. So that's what we explored.
Yeah. So let's change topics now and talk a little bit about one topic that is very trendy nowadays. Let's talk about machine behavior and moral machines and stuff like that. So I mean, machines, particularly, more specifically, AI systems, are getting an increased influence over people's lives over time, and more so, right? I mean,
Yep.
politically, economically, and socially, and stuff like that. So, when it comes to that topic, what are some of the most pressing questions that we have to deal with? I mean, I could ask from a philosophical perspective, but here we're not dealing with philosophy from a scientific perspective.
Right. Uh, okay. So you're right when you say that now, whether we realize it or not, uh, we are increasingly connected with intelligent machines. So
Hmm.
it's not like, meeting with a robot at work. It's often machines in the sense of algorithms,
Hmm.
things which we don't necessarily perceive, but algorithms which are watching us, trying to influence us, making recommendations about what we should do, and so on. So we need to understand what's going on. What is this new way of living in the shadow of the machines? And when we talk about machine behavior, that's a phrase that we introduced with some colleagues to say that we're past the phase where to understand what a machine does, it's enough to know how the machine is programmed. It used to be the case that if you program the machine, or if you could read code, you could actually predict what the machine would do and what would happen. Now it's not really as easy because you start training a machine, you put it in the wild. Sometimes you don't know how it will adjust to the novel data it will meet. Also, it's hard to understand the reciprocal feedback loops that you're going to get when the machine influences humans in a certain way, which in turn change their behavior and influence the machine to change its own behavior and so on. So nowadays, machines have become a bit more like animals. If you want to understand the behavior or predict the behavior of an animal, it's not enough to have its DNA. You can read the whole DNA of the animal, which is like the code of the machine, and maybe you can make predictions from the DNA about what the animal will look like or what its behavior is likely to be in broad strokes. But you certainly cannot predict all the reactions that the animal will have in its environment just from the DNA. For that, you need people who maybe don't understand DNA at all but understand behavior, how to run experiments with an animal, how to design tasks that the animal will do that will help us understand how it's likely to behave. And we said no, now is the time for the same kind of stuff with machines. We have the computer scientists, developers who are like the geneticists for the animals. They know all about the DNA of machines.
Hmm.
But at some point, the machines have become too complex and too intricately involved in their environment. And now what you need is the machine behaviorist, the people who can actually design experiments to study the behavior of the machine as if the machines were animals. And this, by the way, gets even more urgent when we deal with what we call and other called moral machines.
Hmm. Hmm. And by the way, since you mentioned that, what is then a moral machine?
Uh, I mean, the lower bar for a machine to be a moral machine is if the machine is making decision which can have an impact on people, which is moralized. So, for example, if the machine is making decision that could harm people,
Hmm.
you could say it's a moral machine in the sense that when you program the machine, when you define it, you have this moral imperative to minimize the harm that it may cause. So, for example, a self-driving car is a moral machine in this restricted sense, because self-driving cars can have accidents. It could hurt people. So you have a moral imperative to decrease as much as you can the number of accidents that it has. So it is a moral machine in the narrow sense. Now, in a broader sense, or well, at least in another sense, or a harder sense, a machine is a moral machine when it is actually making moral decision itself. When, for example, it has two competing goals, and sometimes and those two goals are moralized, but sometimes there are trade-offs. And so the machine has to solve these trade-offs between two moral values, for example, or two different goals. And it becomes a moral machine in the sense that it becomes endowed with a moral sense, or a way to handle moral conflicts.
Yeah.
And self-driving cars can be also in that situation, because you could say a self-driving car is a moral machine in the first sense because there is a moral imperative to decrease as much as possible the number of accidents. But of course, there will always be some accidents that will remain. And now the machine is in a position where it could have different types of accidents. It could be very careful around cyclists, for example, to decrease the number of accidents with cyclists. But that means it's going to get closer to other cars in the traffic. And that means it's going to increase the number of accidents with other cars. So now there's a trade-off about which kind of accident the machine is trying to have when it cannot avoid the accident. And that makes it a moral machine in the second, more complicated sense.
Yeah, I understand. And so you've been referring to the kinds of questions that we have to deal with when it comes to autonomous vehicles in this case, right? And in this case, autonomous vehicles act as moral machines, at least to a certain extent. But that's the kinds of things we have to think about, and how they really behave, let's say, according to how they're programmed and so on and so forth. But then we also have, as we've mentioned before, how people think about autonomous vehicles as moral agents, let's put it that way. And so what are the kinds of, because there are several different ways to explore how people think about these, for example, when they are put in a situation where they have to decide if it would be better for the vehicle to hit a wall and kill its driver, or kill a pedestrian or several pedestrians, right? There are those kinds of games out there. What are some of people's ideas about autonomous vehicles as moral agents, and if, for example, in particular situations, it is the driver who is responsible for the action or the vehicle?
There are so many questions there. Where do we start?
Well, maybe I don't know. You were also author in a paper, at least I think, with Zim Sharif, right? That is studying that kind of game that I referred to. So, so maybe you could start by mentioning what are some of the conclusions that we get from that kind of approach.
Okay. So the thing is, I suppose we sort of started this whole craze about self-driving cars as moral agents. I mean, we started the craze, right? I don't say we started the field, because some people were thinking about this before we did. But sometimes by accident or luck, you publish something that just puts the problems under the spotlight. And for us, that moment was in 2016, when we published a paper in Science called The Social Dilemma of Autonomous Vehicles. And at that time, we started with this simple idea that I think was in the air with philosophers too, which was, if a self-driving car is in a situation where it's catastrophic situation, crisis situation, where it has a choice between running over someone or someone else, like someone on the road or someone on the sideway, or crashing and killing the driver, or running over someone on the road, what should the car do? And as I mentioned several times already, my usual strategy in this situation is not to think what is the right thing to do, but what do people think is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And so we started doing simple studies. For example, just saying people, hey, if a car has the terrible choice to make of killing one person or five persons, what should the car do, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And we started with very simple questions like that, and very simple results like, well, people think the car should save the greater number. And so we complicated things just a little by saying, okay, but if a car has a choice between killing its driver or its passenger, one passenger, or 5 or 10 pedestrians, should the car kill its passenger? And people continue to say, yes, sure, it should, even killing its own passenger. Okay, so what if you're the passenger of the car? Do you think the car should kill you? And don't smile right now. Don't smile yet, because at this point, people continue telling you, yes, even if I'm the passenger, the car should kill me if it can save 10 people. And at this point, you're desperate for people to say something different. So you finally ask them, okay, but would you buy a car that makes this kind of choice? Kill its passenger to save pedestrian. And finally, at this point, people start telling you, no, I would not buy the car. So there is this state of the world, which I think is the morally right one, where cars can kill their passengers if it can save other people on the road, but I'm not getting into one of these. I want a car that's going to protect me. So that was our first foray into this problem. But I want to just skip that part and move right to the rest, which is that at some point we said, okay, and what if we try to say, should the car kill one child to save 10 adults? And this was the only scenario in which people suddenly were not sure about the right thing to do. As if, they thought the life of one child had value that maybe was higher than the life of 5 adults. And this is where we started to think, this is not going to work. This approach that we're having of adding one scenario at a time, saying, hey, no, there's a child, or maybe do the thing I did in previous years with moral judgment, saying, oh, and these are 3 women, and this is a man, or this are 5 men, and this is and it's 5 women, this is 1 man. We're not going to manage that, because as soon as you start making all those combinations of possible victims of the crash, even if you try to be a bit reasonable with the number of features you can give to people, like sex and age and stuff, the features you give to the characters, very quickly you run into millions of combinations. Because you're starting to build groups of 1 to 5 people, say, or 1 to 10 people, and these people can have like 5 or 6 characteristics, and then the math just explodes. Too many possibilities. So we had 1 million more and more, with way more than 1 million combination or scenarios, and we had that problem. How do you run a survey if you have 1 million questions?
Yeah.
This is just not going to happen, right? Can you imagine giving people a call and telling you, hey, do you have a few minutes to answer my survey? I promise, it's going to be quick. I just have 1 million questions. So that was not going to happen, right? And this is when we invented Moral Machine, which is a website that generates these scenarios and froze them at people will visit the website. And our whole project was to make this website, the Moral Machine, a viral website. So that, if we could get it viral, if people could recommend it to everyone on their social networks, maybe we could get enough people to explore those million scenarios. And that's what we did. And that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I'm not sure if this is correct or not, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really hard then from that scenario where we have a million different possibilities, a million different combinations to really know for sure what are the kinds of traits that people tend to put more weight in, right? Like, for example, being old or being young, a woman, a man, a different social status, and things like that.
Right. So it would be super hard to do this for one single individual. If it's actually impossible to do it for an individual, because if you have 1 million questions, I mean, if that person could actually answer 1 million question, then I think you would have a pretty good idea of what traits this person is sensitive to. But of course, what you're going to have is people who are going to maybe explore 20 scenarios or 12 scenarios. So that's certainly not enough to construct their preferences. But if you have like 2 million people, each contributing 12 to 20 questions, then at the population level, and now you can very, very precisely say which traits have which weight in people's decision at the population level, assuming that you don't have too much individual heterogeneity, but that's...
Mhm. Yeah. And are there any recurring preferences in terms of benefiting one group of people versus the other,
Oh,
or
yeah.
the driver versus the pedestrians, and
Oh,
so on?
completely. Actually, it's a very typical case of what I described very early in our conversation of qualitative universal agreement and
Yeah.
quantitative variation. When
Mm-hmm.
we look at the data of the moral machine, we see, and we have data from, I think, every country in the world. So what we find is that there is universal agreement in the direction of each preference. For example, everywhere people prefer to save women.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere people prefer to save kids rather than older persons.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere people, prefer to save slim people in comparison to overweight people. Don't blame the messenger, right? I'm just reporting responses. So what we find is that the direction of the preference is pretty much constant, but there's huge variation, and there can be huge variation in the strength of the preference. So there might be so almost every country in the world prefer to save men, but this preference is going to be super strong in some places, like France, and super weak in other places, like the Sultanate of Oman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so same thing with age. What we find is that people in the Western world, where countries, have the strongest preference for saving the children and letting the older people die. But if you go to Muslim countries or Asian countries, then the preference is lowered. So suddenly people do not have such a strong preference for killing the older people to save the young. So very interesting cultural variation, but still universal qualitative agreement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to one of the things that I've alluded to when we changed topics to moral machines and autonomous vehicles more specifically, at a certain point there, I was trying to ask you what are the kinds of intuitions that people have when something goes wrong, when, for example, the vehicle crashes against a wall or it goes against some sort of pedestrian and kills it, for example. Um, I mean, what do people think in terms of who or what should be held morally responsible? I mean, is it the machine or the vehicle in this case, or
Right.
the human behind the wheel?
Yeah. So, okay. So you're talking about not fully autonomous vehicles would just do everything, but like personally autonomous vehicles where there's some kind of shared controls. So at some
Yeah.
point you engage the self-driving capacity, but you're still supposed to watch the road and be ready to act, for example. Or in other ways, you're driving the car, but the car is watching what you're doing and is ready to intervene and like brake or change lane if something really dangerous is going on.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so we sort of studied the reaction that people would have in this situation of shared control if something goes really wrong. And complicated results, but by and large, the main message is that people tend to blame the human more than the machine when in those complicated situations where both the human and the machine screw up, you know, and then people tend to think the human is a bit more to blame. And frankly, this is what's happening in the real world. I mean, anecdotally, I don't know if you remember, but March 2018, a pedestrian was killed by a car which was in self-driving mode
Mhm.
in Arizona.
Yeah.
And something really, really striking happened during that accident. So very, very soon after the accident, you could already hear things that were blaming humans. So first, actually, the victim was blamed. The
Mhm.
first pieces of information were things about the victim crossing at night outside of a crosswalk, in like a four-way road, not wearing reflective clothes and being on drugs. So a lot of information that seemed to say, "Hey, look at you, a human made a mistake." Then slowly, information emerged about the driver, and the investigation was saying, "Hey, look at the camera. She's not looking at the road. She seems to be looking at a screen, actually, at her phone, and she's claiming that she was not looking at her phone, but looking at the control panel of the car. But that doesn't seem to match her attitude. So maybe she was not paying attention." And it took like months and months before the mistakes of the car were revealed by the investigation. And in the end, it's a super complicated story about two humans and a machine and other humans which program the machines. But the striking thing is that when something like that happens, the easiest thing for journalists to report and for humans to understand is the action of humans.
Mhm.
You already have a template for what it means for a human to not pay attention. If I tell you the driver was looking at a movie on her phone, easy, right? You understand what that means and you are ready to blame.
Mhm.
If I tell you something like, the car, the programming, the network of the car was trained on a data set that did not contain enough instances of pedestrian walking outside of crosswalk, and I tell you that 2 weeks later because that's the time it took, for me to get this information. That's already, you've already set into your belief that the human screwed up.
Yeah.
So what we observe here is that in situation where humans and machine can both make mistakes that together contribute to the outcome, it's much easier and faster for people to spot the mistakes of the human. It's much longer and harder to understand the mistake of the machine. So the humans here have, a handicap, which
Mhm.
is that their mistakes are much easier and faster to recognize, and therefore are more likely to be blamed, at least in the initial phase after the bad outcome.
Mhm. Okay, very well. So let's move on to the last question. We've been talking about AI systems mostly because these are the kinds of machines we are referring to. And you also have an article where you refer to intelligent machines as possibly being social catalysts as well. So, could you tell us first what is a social catalyst, and then if really these kinds of AI systems can be social catalysts?
Yeah. Yeah. So what we call social catalyst is, the kind of role that a human would have if you call that person a moderator or a chair or someone who is responsible for the good performance of a team. Is someone who's going to diffuse the hostility, make sure that everyone contributes, make sure that there is no tension, keep people on point, and ensure that the team is going to perform better than the sum of its member. And the question we asked is, can machine perform that role? Because it really sounds like something that humans do. It sounds very complicated. You need to be aware of a lot of subtle human dynamics that are sometimes implicit, hard to explain. So it would seem like a job for humans and certainly not for robots, but or algorithms. But the thing is, this paper you're referring to is, I want to be clear about that, is a comment on an empirical paper led by Margaret Traeger. So we were in that paper commenting on the findings of that other team, and I will be happy now to explain, but I just want to make sure that no one believes that was our findings. Okay, so in the paper we were looking at, they showed that they could get pretty good results with a very strange robot. And so let me introduce that. So if you think of using a machine as a social catalyst in a group, well, you can basically have two approaches. You can think, I've got to use a machine because I cannot use a human. So maybe you don't have a well-trained human with you, and you have to use a machine, or maybe you want to do things at such a scale, like monitoring thousands of ongoing online conversations, that you cannot use a human, you're going to have to use a machine. But you're sort of willing to accept that the machine is not going to be as good as a human. The reason you're using a machine is that you cannot use a human, and so you're willing to use a machine that is not as good as a human. On the other end of the spectrum, you can use a machine because you really want a machine to do the job because you think it's going to do it in a different way than a human can do it. So in a very non-human way. That would be the equivalent of AlphaGo for Go. When AlphaGo played Lisettle, and at some point AlphaGo, the machine, played a move that just was not understandable by anyone. It's like a move that no human ever would have considered. The machine just fought in a very machine way and came with a move that was totally non-human. And so you could try for the equivalent in terms of social catalyst. You could have, deep learning network observing people for, millions of hours, and then coming with super strange way to lead a team. And the machine would say things that are completely strange, but for some mysterious reasons, it helps the team to work together. Okay. So these are say two ends of the spectrum. But in that paper that we were commenting on, they did something super unexpected, which is to have a robot behave in a way that would not work for a human, not a strange way, just a bad way. And it worked. So the robot was doing things like lying to people, saying things which are obviously not true, like saying, hey, did I tell you about the day when I wore the World Soccer Cup? Robot, you never did. It's obviously not true, right? Or the robot would say, whoa, I feel so happy to be with you. No, you don't feel happiness. So are telling really bad jokes too. The robot would tell super corny jokes. Now imagine if a human would do that, like trying to tell you stories which are obviously wrong, making super corny jokes all the time. You would be really tired about that person as a moderator. That would not work. But mysteriously, when it's a robot, it works. And so our interpretation of that is that it's a surprising effect, but what we think is that here what's going on is that you have a robot which is making a bad job of contributing to the conversation, and it's good because the robot is lowering the bar for contribution, which is encouraging maybe the most introverted and shy human to take part, because suddenly the robot is so terrible that, you know, whatever they say, it's going to be okay. And at the same time, it's not uncomfortable, as if a human was being a very, very bad contributor, because the robot, you know, you don't have to be polite to the robot. You don't have awkward silence and people looking at each other and not being quite sure what to say to not hurt the feeling of that person making bad contribution. It's a robot. We can laugh to its face and, you know, and mock it for what it's doing. So the fact that the robot can lower the bar for contribution without generating embarrassment and social embarrassment and need for face saving is perhaps like a very unexpected and clever way to use robots as social catalysts.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, Dr. Bonnefon, before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to find your work, like the pieces we've been talking about?
The best places on the internet to find my work would have to be my website, which I just cannot give you off the top of my head. But that would be the place to get all my articles, and also a place to watch some videos of me telling those stories in other places. And follow me on Twitter at JFBonnefon.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Bonnefon, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show again, and it was really fun to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litske and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers, Isar Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.